Appalachian Mountains have always been home to mysteries that defy explanation. Ancient spirits, unexplained disappearances, and encounters. There's a ranger station in the Appalachian Mountains where the last radio call was a scream. 3 years ago, the door's still locked from the inside. His coffee mug is still on the desk, but every hiker who passes after sunset sees a light in the window, moving from room to room. I broke in last month. What I found in that logbook made my hands shake so bad I could barely hold my camera. Welcome to Dark North Stories. I hunt the things that hunt us. The cases police won't touch. The disappearances with no bodies. The recordings that make investigators quit. Up here, the mountains don't just hide secrets, they protect them. And tonight, I'm dragging one into the light. Tonight, I'm bringing you to the place where it happened. Let's begin.
Story 1.
My family inherited a small hunting cabin in the West Virginia mountains from my great-uncle in 2019. The place had been sitting empty for almost 15 years, and honestly, I wasn't expecting much when my dad asked me to drive up and check on the property before we decided whether to sell it or fix it up. The cabin sat about 3 miles off the main road, accessible only by a dirt path that wound through thick forest. Cell service cut out about halfway up the mountain. I should have taken that as a warning. When I arrived that October afternoon, the cabin looked exactly like you'd expect an abandoned mountain property to look. Weathered wood siding, a tin roof spotted with rust, and windows so grimy I couldn't see inside. But the structure seemed solid enough. I grabbed my overnight bag and the spare key my dad had given me, figuring I'd spend one night to get a real feel for the place before making recommendations about its future. The inside was musty, but surprisingly clean. My great-uncle had been meticulous. Everything was covered in white sheets, and there was a thick layer of dust, but no signs of animals or major water damage. I spent the afternoon sweeping and airing out the place, checking the old wood stove and taking inventory. By evening, I felt pretty good about the cabin's potential. That's when I noticed the notebook. It was sitting on the kitchen table, which was odd because I'd cleaned that table earlier and hadn't seen it. The notebook was old, bound in cracked leather, and when I opened it, I found pages and pages of handwritten entries and what I recognized as my great-uncle's careful script. The first entry was dated just 2 months before his death.
Day 1. Someone has been watching the cabin. Found fresh footprints around the perimeter this morning, circling the building twice. Size 11 or 12 boots. Deep tread. Not mine. I flipped through several pages. Every entry was similar. Reports of footprints, of things being moved slightly, of glimpses of movement in the tree line. My great-uncle had been documenting what he believed was someone systematically watching his property. The entries grew more detailed and more paranoid as they continued. Day 12. The watcher was closer last night. I could see the outline of a person standing just beyond the tree line around 3 a.m. Didn't move for over an hour, just stood there, facing the cabin. When I turned on the porch light, the figure stepped back into the shadows, but didn't leave. Day 23. Things inside the cabin are being moved. I'm certain now. The coffee can was on the wrong side of the counter this morning, and my rifle was leaning against the opposite wall from where I left it. Someone has been inside while I was sleeping. Day 31. I saw his face tonight. Middle-aged man, gaunt, with dark hair. He was pressed against the kitchen window around midnight, just staring in. I grabbed my shotgun and ran outside, but he vanished into the forest. I'm installing better locks tomorrow. The final entry was dated 3 days before my great-uncle's death. Day 47. He speaks now. Last night, around 2 a.m., I heard someone walking around the cabin, trying the doors and windows. Then he started talking, not to me, but to himself, like he was having a conversation. I couldn't make out all the words, but he kept repeating, "Time to come home," over and over. I'm leaving tomorrow. This place isn't worth dying for. Day 1. Someone has been watching the cabin. Found fresh footprints around the perimeter this morning, circling the building twice. Size 11 or 12 boots. Deep tread. Not mine. I flipped through several pages. Every entry was similar. Reports of footprints, of things being moved slightly, of glimpses of movement in the tree line. My great-uncle had been documenting what he believed was someone systematically watching his property. The entries grew more detailed and more paranoid as they continued. Day 12. The watcher was closer last night. I could see the outline of a person standing just beyond the tree line around 3 a.m. Didn't move for over an hour, just stood there, facing the cabin. When I turned on the porch light, the figure stepped back into the shadows, but didn't leave. Day 23. Things inside the cabin are being moved. I'm certain now. The coffee can was on the wrong side of the counter this morning, and my rifle was leaning against the opposite wall from where I left it. Someone has been inside while I was sleeping. Day 31. I saw his face tonight. Middle-aged man, gaunt, with dark hair. He was pressed against the kitchen window around midnight, just staring in. I grabbed my shotgun and ran outside, but he vanished into the forest. I'm installing better locks tomorrow. The final entry was dated 3 days before my great-uncle's death. Day 47. He speaks now. Last night, around 2 a.m., I heard someone walking around the cabin, trying the doors and windows. Then he started talking, not to me, but to himself, like he was having a conversation. I couldn't make out all the words, but he kept repeating, "Time to come home," over and over. I'm leaving tomorrow. This place isn't worth dying for.
My hands were shaking as I closed the notebook. My great-uncle had died of a heart attack in town, at the hardware store. Everyone said it was sudden but natural. He was in his 70s and had lived a hard life. But reading these entries, I wondered if stress and fear had contributed to his death. I tried to rationalize what I'd read. Maybe my great-uncle had been developing paranoia in his old age. Maybe he'd been seeing things that weren't there. But then I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the tree line, and my blood went cold. Fresh footprints circled the cabin in the dirt. Large boots, deep tread, exactly as my great-uncle had described. I spent the next 2 hours barricading myself inside, pushing furniture against the doors and closing all the curtains. I tried to convince myself that the footprints could have been mine from earlier, but I knew better. I'd been wearing sneakers, and these prints were clearly from work boots. Around midnight, I heard the first footstep on the porch. The sound was deliberate, heavy, like someone trying to walk quietly but not quite succeeding. Then another step, and another. Someone was slowly walking the perimeter of the porch, testing each board. I sat in the darkness of the living room, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Then the footsteps stopped, directly in front of the main door. For several minutes, there was complete silence. Then I heard the doorknob turn slowly. The door didn't open. I'd thrown the deadbolt, but someone was definitely trying to get in. The knob turned back and forth several times, then stopped. That's when I heard the voice. It was a man's voice, rough and quiet, and he was talking to himself just like my great-uncle had written. "Time to come home," he muttered. "Been waiting long enough. Time to come home now."
The voice moved around the cabin as the footsteps resumed. He tried each window, each door, all while keeping up that quiet, one-sided conversation. "House is ready," he'd say. "Everything's ready now. Just need to come home." This went on for over an hour. I sat paralyzed in the dark, listening to this stranger circle my great-uncle's cabin, trying to get inside, talking about coming home like he belonged there. Every rational part of my brain said I should confront him, demand to know what he wanted, threaten to call the police. But I couldn't move. Something about his voice, about the methodical way he was testing the cabin's defenses, told me that confronting him would be a mistake. Finally, around 2 a.m., the sound stopped. I waited another hour before working up the courage to peek through a curtain. The yard appeared empty, but I couldn't see much in the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room chair with my great-uncle's shotgun across my lap, jumping at every small sound. As soon as dawn broke, I packed my things and drove straight down the mountain. I never went back to the cabin. We ended up selling the property to a developer who demolished the old building and built a modern vacation home on the site. But sometimes I wonder about that man, whoever he was. I wonder if he's still out there in those mountains, still walking around cabins at night, still talking about coming home. And I think about my great-uncle, spending his final weeks in fear, documenting the presence of someone who wanted something from that property, someone who even now might still be waiting for the right person to let him come home.
Story 2. The Signal Hill Incident. I work as a cell tower technician, which means I spend a lot of time in remote locations, doing maintenance and repairs. It's solitary work, but I've always preferred that. Give me a mountaintop and a radio tower over a crowded office any day. I'd been doing this job for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the profession had to offer. I was wrong. In March of 2021, I got called out to a tower on Signal Hill in eastern Kentucky. The tower had been having intermittent signal issues for about 2 weeks, and the local carrier was losing patience. The site was about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding gravel road that climbed steadily for 8 miles through dense forest. It wasn't the most remote tower I'd worked on, but it was definitely isolated. I arrived at the site around 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The tower was a standard 150-foot structure surrounded by a chain-link fence, with a small equipment building at the base. Everything looked normal from the outside. No obvious damage, no signs of vandalism or weather issues. I unlocked the gate and began my standard inspection routine. The first thing I noticed was that the equipment building's door was slightly ajar. That immediately caught my attention because these buildings are always kept locked, and I had the only key for this particular site. I approached carefully and found that the lock had been cut, cleanly severed with bolt cutters or a similar tool. Inside the building, my confusion deepened. Nothing appeared to be missing or damaged, but several pieces of equipment had been moved. Specifically, someone had rearranged the radio equipment to create a small clear space on the floor in the center of the room. In that space, scratched into the concrete with what looked like a nail or a piece of metal, was a message, "They're listening." Story 2. The Signal Hill Incident. I work as a cell tower technician, which means I spend a lot of time in remote locations, doing maintenance and repairs. It's solitary work, but I've always preferred that. Give me a mountaintop and a radio tower over a crowded office any day. I'd been doing this job for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the profession had to offer. I was wrong. In March of 2021, I got called out to a tower on Signal Hill in eastern Kentucky. The tower had been having intermittent signal issues for about 2 weeks, and the local carrier was losing patience. The site was about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding gravel road that climbed steadily for 8 miles through dense forest. It wasn't the most remote tower I'd worked on, but it was definitely isolated. I arrived at the site around 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The tower was a standard 150-foot structure surrounded by a chain-link fence, with a small equipment building at the base. Everything looked normal from the outside. No obvious damage, no signs of vandalism or weather issues. I unlocked the gate and began my standard inspection routine. The first thing I noticed was that the equipment building's door was slightly ajar. That immediately caught my attention because these buildings are always kept locked, and I had the only key for this particular site. I approached carefully and found that the lock had been cut, cleanly severed with bolt cutters or a similar tool. Inside the building, my confusion deepened. Nothing appeared to be missing or damaged, but several pieces of equipment had been moved. Specifically, someone had rearranged the radio equipment to create a small clear space on the floor in the center of the room. In that space, scratched into the concrete with what looked like a nail or a piece of metal, was a message: "They're listening."
A man got out, slowly, deliberately. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He walked toward my truck with an odd, stiff gait, like he was trying to appear casual, but couldn't quite manage it. I rolled down my window as he approached, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Road's closed," he said when he reached my truck. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I didn't see any signs," I replied. "I'm just coming down from the cell tower. Work truck." "Road's closed," he repeated. Exactly the same tone, exactly the same inflection. "Look, I need to get back to town. Is there another way down?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I got the distinct impression he was studying my face, memorizing it. And then he said, "Turn around. Go back up." "I can't turn around here. The road's too narrow." "Then back up." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. I put the truck in reverse and began the slow, careful process of backing up the mountain road. In my rearview mirror, I watched the man get back into his truck and fall.
This continued for over a mile. I would back up, stop to check for obstacles, back up some more. The pickup truck followed, never getting closer, never falling farther behind. It was like some bizarre, slow-motion chase scene. Finally, I reached a spot where the road widened slightly, a small pull-off area used by logging trucks. I managed to turn around, and as soon as I did, the pickup truck stopped. The driver got out again and walked toward me. "You didn't see nothing up there," he said as he reached my window. "Tower's fine, no problems. You go back to town and tell them tower's fine." "There were problems with the equipment. Someone vandalized." "No problems," he interrupted. "Tower's fine. You tell them that." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He stepped back, and I drove past him down the mountain. In my rearview mirror, I watched him get back into his truck, but he didn't follow me. He just sat there at the pull-off, watching me disappear around the curve. When I reached town and finally got clear cell service, I called my supervisor immediately. I reported the vandalism, the strange messages, and my encounter with the man in the pickup truck. My supervisor was concerned enough to contact local law enforcement, but when deputies went to investigate the next day, they found the tower compound empty and secured. This continued for over a mile. I would back up, stop to check for obstacles, back up some more. The pickup truck followed, never getting closer, never falling farther behind. It was like some bizarre, slow-motion chase scene. Finally, I reached a spot where the road widened slightly, a small pull-off area used by logging trucks. I managed to turn around, and as soon as I did, the pickup truck stopped. The driver got out again and walked toward me. "You didn't see nothing up there," he said as he reached my window. "Tower's fine, no problems. You go back to town and tell them tower's fine." "There were problems with the equipment. Someone vandalized." "No problems," he interrupted. "Tower's fine. You tell them that." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He stepped back, and I drove past him down the mountain. In my rearview mirror, I watched him get back into his truck, but he didn't follow me. He just sat there at the pull-off, watching me disappear around the curve. When I reached town and finally got clear cell service, I called my supervisor immediately. I reported the vandalism, the strange messages, and my encounter with the man in the pickup truck. My supervisor was concerned enough to contact local law enforcement, but when deputies went to investigate the next day, they found the tower compound empty and secured.
Story 3. The Hollow Children. I used to be a school bus driver in rural Virginia, covering routes through some of the most remote hollows in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was decent work, good benefits, summers off, and I genuinely liked most of the kids I transported. The route I'm going to tell you about was my regular morning run through Blackwater Hollow, picking up children from families who lived so far back in the mountains that some didn't even have proper addresses. This happened in the fall of 2018. I'd been driving the same route for 3 years, and I knew every pothole, every sharp turn, and every stop by heart. There were 12 regular stops in Blackwater Hollow, serving about 23 children total. The hollow was accessible by a single winding road that followed an old creek bed, with narrow dirt driveways branching off to reach houses tucked back in the trees. The children I picked up were typical mountain kids, shy around strangers but friendly once they got to know you, hardworking families who looked out for each other. I'd built good relationships with most of the parents over the years. They trusted me with their kids, and I took that responsibility seriously. On Monday, October 15th, I noticed something unusual at my third stop. 3 children normally waited there, the Morrison kids, ages 6, 8, and 10, but that morning there were 5 children standing by the road. The 2 extra children looked to be around the same ages as the Morrison kids, but I didn't recognize them. They were pale, thin, and dressed in clothes that seemed too light for the chilly October morning. What struck me most was how still they stood. While the Morrison children were chatting and shifting around like normal kids, these 2 just stood perfectly motionless, staring straight ahead. I opened the bus door and called out my usual greeting. The Morrison kids climbed aboard, chattering about a test they had that day. But the 2 unfamiliar children just stood there. "You 2 getting on?" I asked. The eldest Morrison child, Sarah, looked back at me with a confused expression. "What 2, Mr. Peterson?" I looked again. The 2 strange children were still standing there, but Sarah was looking right through them like they weren't there at all. "Never mind," I said, closing the door. But as I pulled away, I watched in my rearview mirror. The 2 pale children remained standing by the roadside until they disappeared from view. The next morning, they were there again. Same spot, same perfectly still posture, same clothes despite the fact that it had rained overnight and they should have been soaked. This time I was ready with a question. "Sarah," I said as the Morrison kids boarded, "do you know those 2 children standing by your bus stop?" Sarah looked genuinely puzzled. "There's nobody else here, Mr. Peterson, just me and my brothers." I looked again. The pale children were clearly visible to me, standing about 10 feet away from the Morrison kids, but apparently no one else could see them. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every morning, the 2 strange children would be waiting at the third stop, and every morning, none of the other children seemed aware of their presence. I started taking different approaches. I'd ask direct questions about them, point in their direction, even get off the bus once to see if I could interact with them directly. But the moment I stepped off the bus, they would fade away like morning mist. I began to think I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the job was getting to me, or maybe I needed glasses. I scheduled an eye exam and even talked to my doctor about whether I might be experiencing hallucinations. But the visions, if that's what they were, remained consistent. Same 2 children, same location, same ethereal presence. Then, on a Friday morning in early November, something changed. I was approaching the third stop when I saw not 2 children, but 6. The Morrison kids were there as usual, but now 4 pale, motionless children stood nearby. 2 boys and 2 girls, all appearing to be between the ages of 5 and 12. As I slowed the bus, one of the new children, a girl who looked about 7 years old, turned to look directly at me. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and when her gaze met mine through the bus windshield, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. She raised one pale hand and pointed at the bus, then at herself, as if asking for permission to board. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me not to open that door, but I also couldn't ignore a child who needed help, even if I was the only one who could see her. Finally, I opened the door. The Morrison children climbed aboard as usual, but this time something was different. Sarah, the oldest,
paused on the steps and looked back toward where the pale children stood. "Mr. Peterson," she said quietly, "do you ever feel like there's someone watching us out here?" My heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean, Sarah?" "I don't know. Sometimes I get this feeling like there's other kids around, but when I look, there's nobody there. My grandma says some children never found their way home after the mine accident, and they still wait by the road hoping someone will take them to school." "What mine accident?" "The one back in the 1940s. Cave-in trapped a bunch of men, but some of their kids went missing that same week. Folks say they went looking for their daddies in the mine and got lost down there. Never found the bodies." I glanced in my rearview mirror as we pulled away. All 6 pale children were now following the bus. Not running, but somehow keeping pace as we wound through the hollow. They maintained the same perfect formation, the same emotionless expressions, but they stayed with us for nearly a mile before finally fading from view. That afternoon, I stopped by the county library and did some research. What I found made my hands shake as I read. In November 1943, there had indeed been a mine collapse in Blackwater Hollow. 14 men died in the cave-in, and in the chaos that followed, 6 children from mining families had disappeared. The children, aged 5 to 12, had last been seen near the mine entrance, apparently trying to help with rescue efforts. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but the children's bodies were never found.
Story 4. The Night Shift Caller. I worked the overnight shift at a small-town emergency dispatch center in the mountains of North Carolina from 2017 to 2020. It's not glamorous work. Most nights were quiet, with the occasional drunk driving call or domestic disturbance. But every dispatcher who's worked nights in rural areas has stories about the weird calls, the ones that don't make it into official reports because they don't fit into any category that makes sense. This particular call came in on a Tuesday night in February 2019, around 2:30 a.m. I was the only dispatcher on duty, which was normal for weeknights. The phone rang, and when I answered with my standard greeting, I was met with several seconds of static-filled silence. "911, what's your emergency?" I repeated. Finally, a voice came through, an elderly woman speaking very quietly, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "They're in the woods behind my house," she whispered. "They've been there for 3 hours now, just standing there." "Ma'am, can you tell me your address?" She gave me an address on Laurel Creek Road, which I recognized as being way up in the mountains, at least 20 miles from town. I pulled up her information on my computer. Margaret Hensley, 73 years old, lived alone in a house that had been in her family for generations. "Mrs. Hensley, who is in your woods? Can you describe what you're seeing?" "Children," she said, her voice barely audible. "But they're not right. They're too still, too quiet. Children don't stand that still."
I'd taken calls from Mrs. Hensley before. She was sharp as a tack, not given to flights of imagination or false alarms. If she said there were people in her woods, there were people in her woods. "How many children are you seeing, ma'am?" "4 of them, maybe 5. It's hard to tell in the dark, but they're just standing there between the trees facing the house. Been there since before midnight." I dispatched a deputy to check on her, but the response time to her location was going to be at least 30 minutes. In the meantime, I kept her on the line. "Miss Hensley, are your doors and windows locked?" "Yes, but that's not what worries me. It's the way they're standing. No child stands that still for that long, and there's something wrong with their clothes. They look old-fashioned, like something from when I was a little girl." A chill ran down my spine. "Can you see their faces?" "Not clearly, but what I can see—" She paused, and I heard her draw a shaky breath. "They look pale, hollow, and their eyes, even in the dark, their eyes seem to reflect light like an animal's." I was trying to think of rational explanations. Maybe local teenagers playing pranks,
Maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her in the darkness, but Mrs. Hensley's voice carried a conviction that was hard to dismiss. "Ma'am, do you have any relatives who might be playing a joke on you? Grandchildren, maybe?"
"My grandchildren live in Charlotte," she said. "And honey, this isn't a joke. These things aren't entirely natural." The way she said things instead of children made my blood run cold. "Can you move away from the window? Maybe go to an interior room until the deputy arrives?" "I can't stop looking at them," she admitted. "It's like they know I'm watching and they're watching back. If I look away, I'm afraid they might move closer to the house." For the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Hensley provided a steady commentary on what she was seeing. The figures remained motionless, arranged in a rough semicircle about 50 yards from her back door. She described their clothing as old-fashioned dresses and overalls, their hair as long and unkempt, their posture is unnaturally rigid. "One of them just moved," she whispered suddenly. "The smallest one, on the left. It turned its head toward the window I'm looking out of. Did it see you? Oh, it sees me all right. It's smiling now, but not like a child should smile. Too wide, too knowing." I was getting seriously worried. Mrs. Hensley was alone up there with what sounded like either a very elaborate prank or something much worse. I radioed the responding deputy to request backup and to hurry if possible. "Mrs. Hensley, the deputy should be there in about 10 more minutes. Can you hold on?" "They're moving now," she said, her voice tight with fear. "All of them, walking closer to the house, slow, deliberate steps, but they're not making any sound. No footsteps, no rustling leaves."
"Can you get to your front door? Maybe go outside and meet the deputy when he arrives." "I can't leave the back of the house unwatched. If I go to the front, they might try to get in through the back." I heard a sound through the phone that made my heart skip, a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. "They're at the back door," Mrs. Hensley whispered, tapping on the glass, trying to get my attention. "The little one is pressing her face against the window." "Don't open the door, ma'am. Whatever you do, don't let them in." I wouldn't dream of it. But honey, I need to tell you something. I've seen these children before. "What do you mean?" 43 years ago, when I was a young mother, 4 children went missing from families up and down this hollow in the winter of 1976. Never found them, never found any trace. The search went on for weeks. My dispatcher training kicked in. Keep the caller talking, keep them calm, gather information. "Do you think these might be the same children?" "I know they are. I helped with the search back then. I remember their faces, their names. Sarah Beth Miller, Tommy and Johnny Garrett, they were twins. And little Amy Sutton. That's who's standing in my backyard right now, 43 years later, looking exactly the same age they were when they disappeared." The tapping sound intensified, and I could hear Mrs. Hensley's breathing becoming more rapid. "They're trying the door handle now," she said. "It's locked, but they're persistent. The little one, Amy, she's looking right at me through the glass. She's mouthing words." "What is she saying?" "Let us in. We're cold. We want to come home." At that moment, I heard the deputy's radio crackle through my headset. He'd arrived at Mrs. Hensley's property and was approaching the house.
"Mrs. Hensley, Deputy Johnson is there now. Can you see his patrol car?" "I can see the headlights coming up the driveway," she confirmed. "The children stopped trying the door. They're backing away from the house, moving toward the tree line again." I radioed Deputy Johnson to let him know the situation, then listened as he knocked on Mrs. Hensley's front door. Through the phone, I could hear their muffled conversation as she led him inside. A few minutes later, Deputy Johnson radioed back with his report. "Dispatch, I've checked the perimeter of the residence. Found some unusual impressions in the soft ground near the back door. Small footprints, bare feet, which is strange given the cold weather, but no sign of any individuals on the property now. Homeowner seems shaken but unharmed." I stayed on the phone with Mrs. Hensley while Deputy Johnson completed his check of the property. She seemed calmer with him there, but she insisted on what she'd seen. "They were here," she told me quietly. "Those poor lost babies, still trying to find their way home after all these years." Deputy Johnson stayed with her until dawn, and I included her account in my incident report, though I kept the details vague. Strange sightings, possible trespassers, no evidence of criminal activity. But I did my own research the next day. In the newspaper archives, I found the story of the 4 missing children from 1976. They disappeared during a harsh winter storm, and despite extensive searches involving state police and volunteers from 3 counties, no trace of them was ever found. The prevailing theory was that they'd gotten lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure, but their bodies were never recovered.
Mrs. Hensley never called 911 about strange children again, but she mentioned to Deputy Johnson a few weeks later that she'd started leaving food out in her backyard. Sandwiches, fruit, sometimes hot soup in thermos containers. The food was always gone by morning. "I figure if they're still wandering around out there," she told him, "the least I can do is make sure they're not hungry." I transferred to a day shift position a few months later, partly because of that call. Working nights in a place where lost children from 40 years ago might still be looking for home was more than I could handle. But sometimes, when I drive past Laurel Creek Road on my way to visit family in the mountains, I think about Mrs. Hensley and wonder if she's still leaving food out for visitors who should have found peace decades ago. And I wonder what other lost souls might be wandering those dark hollows, still trying to find their way home.
Story 5. The Moonshine Runner's Tale. My great-granddaddy ran shine through these hollers back in the 30s, and he passed down stories that'd curl your hair. But this one ain't from way back then. This happened to me just 3 years ago, up on Copperhead Ridge in eastern Tennessee. I was helping my cousin Billy clear out our family's old still site, the one that's been abandoned since revenuers shut down Granddaddy's operation in 1938. Now, I ain't gonna lie to you, Billy and me were fixing to set up our own little operation up there. Time's been hard since the coal mine shut down, and a man's gotta feed his family somehow. The old site was perfect, hidden back in a laurel thicket, spring water running clear and cold, and far enough from any road that nobody'd stumble across it by accident. We'd been working up there for about a week, cleaning out the old copper pod and laying new fire bricks, when Billy found the mason jar buried under what used to be the mash shed. The jar was old, real old, with a zinc lid that had turned green with age. Inside was a rolled-up piece of paper, yellow and brittle as autumn leaves. "Looky here," Billy said, holding up the jar. "Reckon Granddaddy left us a treasure map?" When we unrolled that paper, though, it wasn't no treasure map. It was a warning, written in Granddaddy's careful hand. "To whoever finds this, stay away from the ridge after dark. The haints that guard this place don't take kindly to strangers, and they got ways of making sure you don't come back. Lost 3 good men here in 37, and I ain't talking about no revenuers. Some things in these mountains been here longer than any of us, and they don't cotton to folks disturbing their peace. This place is cursed, and I'm leaving it for good. Don't say you wasn't warned. Ezra Mullins, November 1938. Billy laughed it off, like he always did when talk turned to mountain spirits and such. Hell, Granddaddy was probably just trying to keep folks away from his still site. You know how these old-timers were about their territory? But I wasn't so sure. My granddaddy had told me stories about Copperhead Ridge when I was little. Stories about things that walked those woods on 2 legs but weren't quite human. Things that had been there since before the Cherokee were pushed out. He called them the Old Ones and said they didn't much care for folks who came disturbing their domain. We decided to keep working, but I made sure we were always off that ridge before sunset. For the next few days, everything went smooth as silk. We got the still rebuilt, tested the firebox, and even ran a small batch of corn liquor just to make sure everything was working proper. That's when the trouble started. On Thursday evening, we were packing up our tools when Billy noticed something odd. All around our campsite, arranged in a perfect circle about 20 feet out, were small piles of stones. Not just any stones. They were stacked in little cairns, 3 rocks high, like tiny monuments. "You do this?" Billy asked, pointing at the stone piles. "Hell no. Thought you did it." We walked the circle, counting. 24 stone piles, evenly spaced, forming a perfect ring around our operation. Each pile was identical. 3 flat stones stacked just so, with the top stone being white quartz that seemed to glow in the fading light. "Might be Cherokee markers," I suggested. "This whole ridge was hunting grounds before the removal." "Cherokee been gone for nigh on 200 years, Billy said. "Whoever did this, they did it recent." That night I had the strangest dreams. I dreamed I was standing in those woods, but they weren't the same woods we'd been working in. These were older, wilder, with trees so tall and thick they blocked out most of the sky. In the dream I could hear voices, not speaking English, not speaking Cherokee neither, but something older. The voices were angry, and they were talking about us. I woke up in a cold sweat, and when I looked at my phone, it was 3:17 a.m. Outside my trailer, I could hear something moving around in the yard. Footsteps, but not quite right. Too light for a person, too deliberate for an animal. The next morning, Billy called me before dawn. "You need to get up here right now," he said, his voice tight with something between fear and anger. "Someone's been at our still." When I got to the ridge, I found Billy standing at the edge of our campsite, staring at what was left of our operation. The still itself was untouched, but everything else had been rearranged. Our tools were laid out in perfect geometric patterns, our supplies stacked in pyramids, and every single jar and bottle we'd brought up there was arranged in a spiral pattern around the fire pit. But that wasn't the worst part. The stone cairns had doubled. Now there were 48 of them, arranged in 2 concentric circles around our site, and each one had grown. Instead of 3 stones high, they were now 5 stones high, with the top stone being a piece of white quartz bigger than my fist. "This is getting too strange for my taste," I told Billy. "Maybe we ought to find another spot." "Like hell," Billy said. "I ain't letting some prankster run me off my own family's land. We're staying, and I'm going to find out who's been messing with our stuff." Against my better judgment, I agreed to spend the night up there. We set up a tent about 50 yards from the still, in a spot where we could watch the site but stay hidden in the tree line. Billy brought his deer rifle, and I had my granddaddy's old .38 revolver. We settled in around dusk, taking turns on watch. Nothing happened for the first few hours, just the normal sounds of night in the mountains. Owls hooting, branch rustling, the distant cry of a fox. Then, around midnight, the forest went completely silent. I've spent my whole life in these mountains, and I know that when the woods go quiet, something's wrong. Every creature in the forest had suddenly stopped making noise, like they were all holding their breath. That's when we saw the lights. They started as tiny pinpricks of blue-white light floating between the trees about 100 yards from our position. At first, I thought they might be fireflies, but fireflies don't fly in straight lines, and they sure don't maintain formation like soldiers on parade. The lights moved closer, weaving between the trees in patterns that seemed almost like a dance. As they got nearer, I could see they weren't floating randomly. They were following the old game trails that crisscrossed the ridge, trails that had been there since before white men ever set foot in these mountains. "What in the hell?" Willie whispered, raising his rifle. "Don't," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't point that thing at them." The lights had reached our campsite now, and I could see there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They circled the still, moving in and out of the stone cairns, and as they moved, I started to hear something that made my blood run cold. Singing. It wasn't in English, wasn't in any language I recognized. The melody was ancient, mournful, like a funeral dirge sung by voices that had been silent for centuries. The lights pulsed in rhythm with the singing, and I realized that each light was connected to a voice. As we watched, frozen with terror, the lights began to take shape. Not human shapes exactly, but something close to human. Tall, thin figures that seemed to be made of starlight and shadow, moving with a grace that was beautiful and horrible at the same time. They were dancing around our still, and as they danced, they began to change our campsite. The tools we'd left scattered around were picked up by invisible hands and arranged in complex patterns. The stone cairns grew taller, adding rocks that seemed to appear from thin air. And all the while, that ancient singing filled the night air with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. One of the figures, taller than the rest, with light that burned brighter, approached our hiding spot. It didn't walk exactly, it flowed like moonlight across water. When it was about 10 feet away, it stopped and turned what might have been a face toward us. When it spoke, the voice was like wind through autumn leaves, ancient and sad and infinitely weary. "Why do you bring fire to our sacred place? Why do you disturb the peace of the old ways?" it asked. Billy tried to raise his rifle, but his hands were shaken so bad he couldn't aim. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "We didn't know it was sacred. We're just trying to make a living." "Your ancestor knew," the figure said. "He learned respect for the ancient laws. He left this place in peace when we asked him to. Will you do the same?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The figure stared at us for a long moment, and I felt like it was looking straight through me, reading every thought I'd ever had. "You will dismantle what you have built," it continued. "You will take nothing from this place but the knowledge that some boundaries should not be crossed. Do this, and you may leave in peace. Refuse, and join those who came before you in guarding this sacred ground." The figure gestured toward the forest, and in the blue light I could see other shapes moving between the trees. Human shapes, but wrong somehow, too pale, too thin, moving with the same flowing grace as the light beings. "The men your ancestor spoke of. They chose to stay when we offered them the same choice we offer you." Billy and I didn't need to discuss it. We nodded frantically, and the figure seemed satisfied. It flowed back toward the dancing lights, and gradually the entire procession moved away from our campsite, following the old trails deeper into the mountains. The singing faded with them, until the only sound was our own ragged breathing. We didn't sleep that night. As soon as dawn broke, we dismantled every piece of equipment we'd brought up there. We filled in the fire pit, scattered the stone cairns, and carried every tool and jar back down the mountain. It took us 3 trips, and we worked in complete silence, both of us understanding that this was our one chance to leave Copperhead Ridge alive. I never went back to that place, and I made sure to tell my boys to stay away from it too. Billy moved to Charlotte the next month, said he couldn't stand being in the mountains anymore, knowing what was up there. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, I can hear that ancient singing drifting down from Copperhead Ridge. It reminds me that there are things in these mountains older than any of us, things that were here before the Cherokee, maybe before any humans at all. And sometimes, when folks ask me why I don't run shine like my granddaddy did, I tell them the truth, because there are some family traditions that ain't worth keeping, and some places that are better left alone. Story 6. The Hollow Road Hitchhiker. I've been driving these mountain roads for 37 years, hauling everything from lumber to livestock between the hollers and towns of West Virginia. In all that time, I seen plenty of strange things: fog that moves against the wind, lights in the sky that ain't airplanes, animals that watch you with eyes too knowing for their kind. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered on Route 19 near Summersville in the winter of 2020. It was coming on toward midnight on a February night, bitter cold with snow starting to fall. I was heading home after delivering a load of furniture down to Charleston, and the roads were getting slick fast. Most folks had sense enough to stay inside on a night like that, so I had the highway pretty much to myself. That's when I seen her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road about 2 miles past the Muddletee Creek Bridge, just at the edge of my headlight beams. Young woman, maybe 25 or so, wearing a white dress that seemed too thin for the weather. No coat, no hat, just standing there in the falling snow with her thumb out like she was hitchhiking. Now, I ain't in the habit of picking up strangers, especially not lone women on dark roads. Too many bad things can happen, and I got a reputation to maintain. But something about the way she was standing there, so still and patient in that freezing weather, made me feel sorry for her. I pulled over about 50 feet past where she was standing and waited to see what she'd do. In my side mirror, I watched her walk toward the truck, moving slow and careful on the icy pavement. When she got close enough for me to see her clear, my heart nearly stopped. She was beautiful, but in a way that didn't seem quite natural. Skin white as fresh snow, dark hair that didn't move even though the wind was blowing fierce, and eyes that reflected my truck's lights like an animal's. But what really got my attention was that white dress. It wasn't wet despite the falling snow, and it wasn't torn or dirty despite her being out on that rough mountain road. She knocked on my passenger window, gentle-like, and when I rolled it down, she spoke in a voice that was soft and melodic, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "I need to get to Beckley, if you're going that way." I wasn't going to Beckley. My route home would take me north toward Flatwoods. But something about her voice made me want to help, made me feel like turning south wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. "I can take you as far as the Beckley exit," I heard myself saying, though I hadn't meant to offer that much. She smiled, and when she did, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the truck's heater. That would be wonderful. I've been waiting so long for someone kind to stop. She climbed into the passenger seat with a grace that seemed almost like floating, and immediately the cab filled with a scent I couldn't identify. Something like mountain laurel mixed with old roses. The temperature seemed to rise, though I hadn't adjusted the heat, and the snow on the windshield melted away, despite the fact that the engine wasn't even fully warmed up yet. "What's your name, honey?" I asked as I pulled back onto the highway. "Sarah," she said, settling back in the seat. "Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood. What's yours?" "Tom McKinney. Been driving these roads most of my life. Don't believe I seen you around before." She was beautiful, but in a way that didn't seem quite natural. Skin white as fresh snow, dark hair that didn't move even though the wind was blowing fierce, and eyes that reflected my truck's lights like an animal's. But what really got my attention was that white dress. It wasn't wet despite the falling snow, and it wasn't torn or dirty despite her being out on that rough mountain road. She knocked on my passenger window, gentle-like, and when I rolled it down, she spoke in a voice that was soft and melodic, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "I need to get to Beckley, if you're going that way." I wasn't going to Beckley. My route home would take me north toward Flatwoods. But something about her voice made me want to help, made me feel like turning south wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. "I can take you as far as the Beckley exit," I heard myself saying, though I hadn't meant to offer that much. She smiled, and when she did, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the truck's heater. That would be wonderful. I've been waiting so long for someone kind to stop. She climbed into the passenger seat with a grace that seemed almost like floating, and immediately the cab filled with a scent I couldn't identify. Something like mountain laurel mixed with old roses. The temperature seemed to rise, though I hadn't adjusted the heat, and the snow on the windshield melted away, despite the fact that the engine wasn't even fully warmed up yet. "What's your name, honey?" I asked as I pulled back onto the highway. "Sarah," she said, settling back in the seat. "Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood. What's yours?" "Tom McKinney. Been driving these roads most of my life. Don't believe I seen you around before." Something in the way she said traveling made me glance over at her. In the green light from the dashboard, her skin looked even paler than before, almost translucent, and when she turned to look at me, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. She wasn't breathing. Her chest wasn't moving at all. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the strange light and the late hour were playing tricks on my eyes, but I kept stealing glances at her as we drove, and the more I looked, the more convinced I became that something wasn't right about my passenger. "Sarah," I said finally, "you got family in Beckley? Someone expecting you?" "I had family there once," she replied, her voice taking on a sad, distant quality. "A long time ago. I'm hoping they'll still remember me." "How long you been away?" "Since 1952. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made my blood run cold. If she'd been away since 1952, she'd have to be close to 90 years old. But the woman sitting next to me couldn't have been more than 25. I was starting to feel like I'd made a serious mistake picking her up, but we were already committed to the route toward Beckley, and I didn't know how to politely ask a lady to get out of my truck in the middle of a snowstorm. "Tell me about your family," I said, trying to keep the conversation normal. "My daddy worked the mines," she said, staring out at the passing landscape. "Mama took in washing and mending. We lived in a little house on Prosperity Street, right near the company store. I was engaged to be married to a boy named James Whitman. He worked the mines too." She spoke about these people like she'd seen them yesterday, but if what she'd said about being away since 1952 was true, they'd all be long dead by now. "What happened in 1952?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "There was an accident," she said quietly. "I was coming home from Charleston on the bus, coming home to marry James. It was snowing, just like tonight. The bus went off the road near the Mudlety Creek Bridge." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The Mudlety Creek Bridge. That was where I had first seen her, standing by the side of the road. "How many people?" I started to ask, but she interrupted me. 12 people died that night," she said, "including the driver and a young woman who was supposed to be married the next day." I pulled over at the next wide spot on the road, my hands shaking so bad I could barely steer. When I looked over at Sarah, she was smiling that same sad, beautiful smile, but now I could see right through her to the passenger door behind. "You're dead," I whispered. "I have been for 68 years, she confirmed. "But every year on the anniversary of the accident, I get to try again. I get to try to make it home to James, to the wedding I never had, to the life that was taken from me." "But James would be," I started to say. then stopped. If he was still alive, he'd be nearly 90 by now. Dead, she finished for me. I know, everyone I loved is dead. The house on Prosperity Street was torn down 20 years ago. Even the mine closed in the 80s. But I keep trying to get home because it's the only thing I know how to do. I stared at her, this beautiful ghost who'd been trying to complete the same journey for nearly 7 decades. What happens when you get to Beckley? What happens when you find out there's nothing left? I fade away until next year, and then I try again, hoping this time will be different. The sadness in her voice was so profound that I felt tears starting in my eyes. This poor girl had been trapped in the same hopeless cycle for 68 years, trying over and over to reach a home that no longer existed. "Sarah," I said gently, "what if I told you there was another way? What if you didn't have to keep trying to go back?" She looked at me with those strange, reflecting eyes. "What do you mean?" "What if you let go? What if you stopped trying to get home and just moved on?" For a moment, she was completely still, considering my words. Then, slowly, she began to smile. Not the sad smile she'd worn before, but something peaceful and genuine. "Do you think that's possible?" she asked. "After all this time?" "I think you deserve some peace," I told her. "I think James would want you to have peace, too." She reached over and took my hand, and though her touch was cold, it was also gentle and real. "Thank you, Tom, for stopping, for listening, for caring about a lost soul." As I watched, she began to fade, becoming more transparent with each passing second. But instead of the sadness I expected to feel, I was filled with a sense of warmth and rightness. "Give my love to the mountains," she whispered as she disappeared completely. "Tell them Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood finally made it home." The truck cab felt empty after she was gone, but not lonely. The scent of mountain laurel and roses lingered for a few more miles, and I swear the snow seemed to fall more gently, like the mountains themselves were celebrating her release. I never saw Sarah again, though I drove that same route many times over the following years. But every February, on the anniversary of that old bus accident, I make sure to drive slow past the Muddletee Creek Bridge, just in case there's another lost soul who needs help finding their way home. And sometimes, when the snow is falling just right and the moon is hidden behind the clouds, I catch a whiff of mountain laurel on the wind, and I know that somewhere in these ancient hills, Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood has finally found the peace she was looking for. Story 7. The Company House on Horseshoe Bend. My daddy worked the mines in Logan County, West Virginia for 33 years before black lung finally got him. When the company closed down operations in 1995, they sold off all the old company houses dirt cheap to anyone willing to take them as is. That's how me and my wife Linda ended up buying the little 2-bedroom house on Horseshoe Bend for $800 cash. Should have known there was a reason it was so cheap. The house sat at the end of a row of identical company houses, all built in the 1920s when the mine was booming. Most of the other houses had been bought by locals and fixed up nice, but our house, number 47, had been sitting empty for years. The real estate woman said the last family to live there had moved out sudden-like in 1987 and never came back for their belongings. When we first walked through the place in March of 2019, it looked like folks had just up and left in the middle of supper. Dishes still on the table, clothes in the closets, family pictures on the mantelpiece. Linda thought it was sad, all those personal things just abandoned like that. "We'll pack it all up respectful," she said, looking at the family photos. "Maybe we can track down the folks who lived here, give them their belongings back." They were tucked away in dresser drawers, stuck between mattresses, hidden behind picture frames. All of them were addressed to the same woman, Mrs. Dorothy Hutchins, and they were all from the same coal company, dated between 1985 and 1987. The first few letters were standard business correspondence about mining operations, shift schedules, safety meetings. But as we read through them in chronological order, they got stranger and more ominous. A letter from June 1986 informed Mrs. Hutchins that her husband Earl had been selected for special underground duties and would be working deeper shifts than usual. Another letter from August warned that Earl might be changed by his new assignment and that the family should prepare for adjustment periods. By December 1986, the letters were downright unsettling. One informed Dorothy that Earl was adapting well to the deeper workings, but cautioned that he may exhibit behavioral changes consistent with prolonged underground exposure. Another suggested that the children should avoid direct contact with their father during certain phases of the moon. The final letter, dated February 1987, was the worst. Mrs. Hutchins, we regret to inform you that your husband Earl has fully transitioned to deep mine status. He will no longer be able to maintain surface residence. Company housing at 47 Horseshoe Bend must be vacated within 30 days. Earl will continue his duties indefinitely in the lower workings. Please do not attempt to contact or visit him. For your family's safety, any attempt to access the deep mines will result in severe consequences. Compensation for Earl's permanent service has been deposited in your account. Please consider this matter closed. Blackstone Mining Operations, Deep Works Division. Linda was as puzzled as I was. What do you reckon deep mine status means? And why couldn't he live at home anymore? I'd heard stories from the old-timers about the deepest parts of the Blackstone mine, places where they dug so far down that the air got thick and strange, where miners reported seeing things that shouldn't be there, hearing voices calling from tunnels that weren't on any company map. But those were just stories, the kind of tales men tell when they've been too long in the dark. We decided to ask around about the Hutchins family, see if any of the neighbors remembered them. What we learned made my skin crawl. Mrs. Jenkins, who lived 3 houses down, remembered the family well. Sweet woman Dorothy was, kept to herself mostly, especially toward the end. Her husband Earl, now that's a different story. According to Mrs. Jenkins, Earl Hutchins had started acting strange sometime in late 1986. He'd come home from his shifts looking like he'd been rolling in coal dust for days, even though other miners on his crew looked normal enough. And he started walking funny, like his joints didn't bend the right way anymore. She said the family had started keeping their curtains drawn all the time, and the children stopped playing outside. Dorothy would do her shopping early in the morning before most folks were up. Always looked scared, like she was being watched. The strangest part, according to Mrs. Jenkins, was what happened the night before the family disappeared. I was up late with one of my grandchildren who was running a fever, she told us. Must have been around 2 a.m. when I looked out the window and saw Earl Hutchins in his backyard, but he wasn't alone. There were 3 other men with him, and they all looked just like he did, covered in coal dust, moving wrong like puppets with loose strings. She said the 4 men had been digging in the backyard with their bare hands, clawing at the earth like animals. They was making holes all over the yard, not deep ones, just scrapes in the dirt, and they was talking to each other, but not in English, made sounds like rocks grinding together. The next morning, the Hutchins family was gone. Their car was still in the driveway, their belongings still in the house, but they'd vanished without a trace. After hearing that story, Linda and I were both feeling uneasy about the house. But we'd already put our money down and spent weeks fixing the place up. We decided to stay, but I made sure to keep my granddaddy's old shotgun loaded and close by. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. The house felt normal enough during the day, and we were starting to think the strange stories were just small-town gossip blown out of proportion. Then we found the basement. I'd noticed that the house seemed to have more interior space than the basement accounted for, like there was a room somewhere that we hadn't discovered. After measuring and remeasuring, I determined that there had to be space behind the basement's back wall. When I tapped on the wall, it sounded hollow. A little more investigation revealed a section of paneling that was actually a hidden door, held in place by a simple latch mechanism. Behind that door was another room, smaller than the main basement, with a dirt floor and stone walls. The air in there was thick and musty, and it smelled like coal dust and something else, something organic and unpleasant. The floor of the hidden room was covered with holes, dozens of them, each about the size of a man's fist, dug deep into the packed earth. Some were fresh, the dirt around them still loose. Others looked older, with edges that had hardened over time. At the back of the room, scratched into the stone wall with what looked like fingernails, was a message, "They come up through the holes when the moon is dark. Earl says we have to feed them or they'll take the children. God help us all. D.H. 1987. Linda took one look at that room and declared she was done with the house. "I don't care how much money we put into this place," she said. "We're leaving, and we're leaving tonight." But before we could pack our things, the sun went down, and we discovered we were no longer alone in the house. It started with sounds from the basement, scraping, digging sounds, like someone was clawing at the dirt floor. Then we heard voices, muffled and strange, speaking in that same grinding language Mrs. Jenkins had described. I grabbed my shotgun and crept down to the basement, Linda right behind me with a flashlight. The main basement was empty, but the hidden room. There were things coming up through the holes. They looked like men, but wrong somehow, too thin, too pale, with fingers that were longer than they should be, and eyes that reflected our flashlight beam like coal. They were covered in mine dust and wearing the remnants of mining clothes, but the fabric was rotted and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. At the back of the hidden room, scratched into the stone wall with what looked like fingernails, was a message, "They come up through the holes when the moon is dark. Earl says we have to feed them or they'll take the children. God help us all. D.H. 1987.
"Dorothy," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "Where is Dorothy? The children must be fed to the deep ones. The contract must be honored." I didn't wait to hear any more. I fired both barrels of the shotgun into that room, and Linda and I ran upstairs and straight out the front door. We drove to a motel in town and didn't come back until the next afternoon, and even then, only long enough to grab our essential belongings. We never spent another night in that house. We sold it back to the company for the same $800 we'd paid, no questions asked. They seemed eager to have it back, which should have told us something right there. The house on Horseshoe Bend still sits there, empty again, waiting for the next family desperate enough to buy a house they can't afford to walk away from. But if you're ever in Logan County and someone offers you a real good deal on company housing, you might want to ask yourself why the price is so low. And if you ever hear stories about miners who work too deep and too long in places that don't appear on any map, you might want to remember that some jobs change a man in ways that can't be undone. Because once the mountain claims you, it never really lets you go. Story 8. The Root Cellar Revival. I inherited my great-aunt Minnie's place up on Scratch Ankle Ridge in Floyd County, Kentucky, when she passed in the spring of 2021. Aunt Minnie had been what folks in these parts call touched. She talked to herself, collected strange things, and had peculiar notions about the old ways that most people had forgotten. When she died at 93, I was the only family member willing to take on her property.
mainly because nobody else wanted to deal with 40 acres of steep mountain land and a house that hadn't been properly maintained in decades. I should have paid more attention to why everyone else in the family wanted nothing to do with the place. The house itself was typical for these mountains, a 2-story frame building built sometime in the 1890s with a wraparound porch and a stone foundation that had probably been laid by hand. What made it unusual was all the additions Aunt Minnie had built over the years, little rooms and sheds that seemed to serve no obvious purpose, connected to the main house by covered walkways and makeshift bridges. But the strangest feature of the property was the root cellar. It was built into the hillside behind the house, with stone walls that looked much older than the house itself. The wooden door was thick as a man's arm and secured with 3 separate locks, 2 modern deadbolts and 1 old iron lock that looked like something out of a medieval castle. When I found the keys in Aunt Minnie's kitchen drawer, they were tied together with a black ribbon, and there was a note attached in her shaky handwriting. Don't open after dark. Don't open during the new moon. Don't open if you hear singing from inside. Some things should stay buried. M. E. Holloway. Like most rational people, I figured the note was just more evidence of Aunt Minnie's mental decline. She'd always been superstitious, always believing in things that didn't make sense to modern folks. A root cellar was just a place to store vegetables and preserve food. What possible harm could come from opening it? I decided to check out the cellar on a Saturday morning in early June, after I'd spent a week cleaning out the house and getting a feel for the property. The 3 locks opened easily enough, though the old iron one required some oil and patience. When I finally pulled the heavy door open, I was hit with a rush of cold air that carried the scent of earth and something else, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a closed room. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, extending back into the hillside much farther than seemed necessary for food storage. Stone shelves lined the walls, and most of them were filled with glass jars containing things I couldn't readily identify. Some held what looked like preserved vegetables or fruits, but others contained substances that definitely weren't food. Twisted roots, dried herbs, and liquids that glowed faintly in the dim light. At the very back of the cellar, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a shrine of sorts, built into a natural alcove in the stone wall. Candles of various sizes surrounded a wooden platform, and on that platform sat a collection of photographs, old black-and-white images of people I didn't recognize, all arranged in a careful circle around what appeared to be a human skull. The skull was old, yellowed with age, and decorated with carved symbols that looked like a mixture of Cherokee writing and something else entirely. Around its base were scattered offerings, coins, jewelry, small bundles of herbs tied with colored string. But the most disturbing part was the journal lying open beside the shrine. It was Aunt Minnie's handwriting, but the entries were recent, some dated just weeks before her death. As I read, I realized that my great-aunt hadn't been as touched as everyone thought. She'd been documenting something that had been happening in that root cellar for decades. June 3rd, 1987. They came again last night. 7 spirits this time, all from the old families. They want me to help them settle their business with the living. I told them the same thing I always tell them. I ain't getting involved in feuds that should have died with the people who started them. October 15th, 1994. The Whitman ghost is getting more insistent. Says his great-grandson cheated him out of timber rights that should have stayed in the family. Wants me to arrange a meeting. I keep telling him that ain't how it works, but spirits don't like to take no for an answer. February 22nd, 2001. Had to lock the cellar up tight tonight. The new moon brings them out stronger, and they're getting bold. Mrs. Salyer's spirit tried to follow me up to the house. She's still mad about that boundary dispute from 1932, and she wants to have words with the current landowner. I told her dead folks don't get to settle property claims, but she ain't listening. The entries continued for pages, detailing decades of encounters with the spirits of mountain people who died with unfinished business. According to Aunt Minnie's records, the root cellar had somehow become a gathering place for the restless dead, a neutral ground where they could try to communicate with the living world. And apparently, Aunt Minnie had been serving as an intermediary. March 8th, 2019. Getting too old for this. The spirits are getting impatient with me, and I can't handle them like I used to. Need to find someone in the family who can take over, someone who's got the sight and the backbone to deal with mountain ghosts who don't know when to let go. The final entry was dated just a week before her death. May 14th, 2021. Told them I'm dying soon, and they're in a panic. They want to know who's going to help them when I'm gone. I told them my great-nephew might have the gift. His grandmother could see spirits clear as day, but I don't know if he'll understand, or if he'll just think I'm crazy like the rest of the family does. If you're reading this, child, and you can see them too, remember, they just want to be heard. But don't let them manipulate you into fighting battles that ain't yours to fight. I closed the journal with shaking hands, trying to convince myself that this was all just the delusions of an elderly woman who'd spent too much time alone. But as I turned to leave the cellar, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. They were standing in the shadows near the entrance, translucent figures in old-fashioned mountain clothing, watching me with eyes that held decades of accumulated grievance and sorrow. I counted 5 of them at first, then 7, then more than I could keep track of as they seemed to materialize from the stone walls themselves. An elderly woman in a faded calico dress stepped forward, her form flickering like candlelight. When she spoke, her voice was clear but distant, like an echo from the bottom of a well. "You're Minnie's boy," she said. "She told us you might come. I'm Beulah Whitman, and I got business that needs settling." I tried to back toward the door, but more spirits had appeared between me and the exit. They weren't threatening, exactly, but they were determined, pressing closer with the desperate intensity of people who'd been waiting too long to be heard. "Now hold on," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't know nothing about settling business for dead folks. I just inherited this place." "That's how it works in these mountains," said another spirit, a tall man in mining clothes. "Property passes down, and so do the obligations. Minnie kept the peace between the living and the dead for 60 years. Now that job falls to you." They began telling me their stories then, all talking at once, a chorus of grievances and unfinished business that stretched back generations. Land disputes, family feuds, promises broken, debts unpaid, all the messy complications of human life that death hadn't been able to resolve. I listened for what felt like hours, my head spinning with names and dates and accusations that meant nothing to me. Finally, I held up my hands for silence. "Look," I said, "I appreciate that y'all got problems that need sorting out, but I ain't from around here, and I don't know none of these people you're talking about. Maybe you need to find someone else to help you." The spirits exchanged glances, and I could feel their disappointment like a physical weight in the air. Beulah Whitman spoke for the group. "There ain't nobody else, son.
The old families have died out or moved away, and the young folks don't believe in the old ways anymore. You're the last connection we got to the living world. What happens if I just walk away, sell the property, and forget about all this? Then we're trapped here forever, said the miner, bound to this place by unfinished business, getting more bitter and angry with each passing year. Eventually, we'll start taking our frustrations out on anyone who comes near. The living won't be safe on this mountain. I looked around at their faces, sad, desperate, worn down by decades of waiting for justice that might never come. These weren't evil spirits or demons. They were just people who died with problems that needed solving, trapped between worlds because they couldn't let go. "All right," I said finally. "I'll try to help. But I ain't guaranteeing nothing, and I ain't getting involved in anything dangerous or illegal." The relief in the cellar was palpable. One by one, the spirits began to fade away until only Beulah remained. "Thank you," she said. "Minnie always said you were good people. We'll start small, just a few simple matters that need attention, nothing you can't handle." She disappeared then, and I was alone in the cellar with the shrine and the journal and the weight of a responsibility I'd never asked for. Over the following months, I found myself serving as a spiritual mediator for the mountain dead. Most of their requests were simple enough: messages delivered to living family members, small disputes clarified, forgotten graves located and tended. I learned to visit the cellar during daylight hours when the spirits were calmer and more reasonable. But I always made sure to follow Aunt Minnie's rules. Never open the cellar after dark, never during the new moon, and never when I heard singing from inside. Because some nights, when the mountain mist rolls in thick and the moon is hidden behind clouds, I can hear voices down there, not the familiar spirits I've grown to know, but something older and hungrier, singing songs in languages that predate any human settlement in these hills. I still live in Aunt Minnie's house, and I still tend to her unusual legacy. The livin' folks in the valley think I'm getting as strange as she was, talking to myself and keeping odd hours. But the mountain spirits are content, and the peace between the worlds holds steady. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work is done and the spirits are resting easy, I think about how family obligations in these mountains run deeper than most people understand, extending not just to the living, but to all those who came before and left their mark on the land. Because in Appalachia, death doesn't always mean goodbye. Sometimes it just means your problems become someone else's inheritance. Story 9. The Bell Witch's Kin. I'm fixin' to tell you something that'll make your blood run cold. Something that happened to my family just last year up in Robertson County, Tennessee, not 20 miles from where the famous Bell Witch terrorized the Bell family back in the 1800s. Most folks think that story ended when old John Bell died and the witch moved on, but I'm here to tell you that some curses run deeper than one family, deeper than one generation, and some witches got kin that carry on their work. My name's Caleb Morrison, and my family's been in these Tennessee hills since before the Civil War. We always knew we had some connection to the Bell family. My great-great-grandmother was a Bell before she married into the Morrisons, but we never thought much about it until we inherited the old Morrison home place from my grandfather in 2022. The house sits in a hollow that locals call Witch's Holler, though most maps just call it Morrison Creek. It's a 2-story log house that's been added onto so many times over the years that it looks like a puzzle somebody couldn't quite figure out. My granddaddy had lived there alone for 15 years after Grandmama died, and when he passed, nobody in the family wanted the responsibility of maintaining such an isolated property.
Nobody except me and my wife, Rebecca. We saw it as a chance to get away from city life, raise our 2 young daughters somewhere they could run free and learn about their mountain heritage. Lord help us, we had no idea what we were walking into. The earliest letter was from 1847, written by my great-great-great-grandfather to his brother. The Bell Witch has followed Sarah to our home. It speaks to her in voices of the dead, moves objects when we're not looking, and fills our nights with sounds that ain't natural. Sarah says it calls itself Kate, same as what tormented the Bells, but this one claims to be Kate's sister, seeking revenge for some slight our families gave to their bloodline generations ago. I fear we are cursed, brother, cursed by something that won't rest until every Bell and every Bell descendant pays for sins we don't even understand. The documents continued through the decades, reports of household objects moving on their own, disembodied voices threatening family members, crops failing despite good weather, livestock dying under mysterious circumstances. Each generation had documented their experiences, and each generation had tried to find ways to appease or banish whatever was tormenting them. But the most recent entries were the most disturbing. My granddaddy had been keeping records right up until his death, and according to his notes, the supernatural activity had been escalating dramatically over the past decade. December 15th, 2021. It's getting stronger. Knocked all the dishes off the kitchen table last night while I was eating supper. Found scratches on the walls this morning, words carved deep into the wood. The blood debt remains unpaid. I'm afraid of what'll happen when I'm gone and there's nobody left to keep it contained to this hollow. His final entry was dated just 3 days before his death. January 8, 2022. Caleb called today, says he wants to move his family into the house. I tried to warn him off, but he thinks I'm just being a stubborn old man. How do you tell your grandson that he's inheriting a curse along with the property? How do you explain that some families carry darkness in their bloodline, and that darkness never sleeps? God forgive me, but I can't find the strength to tell him the truth. Maybe the curse will die with me. Maybe I'm just a crazy old man seeing things that ain't there. But if you're reading this, Caleb, and the strangeness has started up again, remember this. She wants the young ones. She's always wanted the young ones. Protect your girls and get them away from this place before it's too late. I showed the letters to Rebecca, and we spent long hours discussing whether we should reconsider moving to the home place. But we'd already given up our apartment in Nashville, and frankly, we couldn't afford to live anywhere else. We decided to proceed with the move, but to keep careful watch for any signs of the supernatural activity Granddaddy had described. For the first month, everything seemed normal. The girls, Emma, age 8, and Sophie, age 6, took to mountain life like ducks to water. They spent their days exploring the creek, building fairy houses in the woods, and listening to Rebecca read them stories on the front porch. It was exactly the kind of childhood I dreamed of giving them. Then Emma started talking to someone who wasn't there. It began innocently enough. She'd be playing alone in her room, and I'd hear her carrying on conversations with what sounded like another child. When I asked her about it, she said she'd made friends with a girl named Katie who lived in the walls of the house. Katie knows all the best hiding spots. She's been here longer than anybody, even longer than great-granddaddy. She says she's been waiting for us to come home. Rebecca and I exchanged worried glances, remembering Granddaddy's letters and the name Kate that had appeared in the historical accounts, but we tried to convince ourselves it was just normal childhood imagination, the kind of invisible friend many kids develop. Our denial became impossible to maintain when Sophie started having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming almost every night, claiming that a woman in old-fashioned clothes was standing beside her bed, staring at her with eyes like black holes. The woman never spoke, Sophie said, just stood there watching, sometimes for hours at a time. She's waiting for something, Daddy. She's waiting for us to do something wrong so she can punish us." The nightmares were accompanied by other phenomena that made it clear we weren't dealing with childhood imagination. Objects in the girl's room would be rearranged overnight. Toys stacked in impossible formations. Books arranged to spell out words. Drawings scattered across the floor that neither girl remembered making. The drawings were the most disturbing part. They showed stick figures of our family, but Emma and Sophie were always separated from Rebecca and me by dark, scribbled shapes that looked like storms or shadows. In some drawings, the girls' stick figures had X's marked over their eyes. When I asked Emma about the drawings, she said Katie had been teaching her how to draw the truth about what's coming. "Katie says the shadow lady is getting impatient," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "She says Shadow Lady wants to take me and Sophie somewhere safe, away from the bad things that are going to happen to you and Mama." That night, I decided to sit up and keep watch over the girls' room. I positioned myself in the hallway where I could see both their beds, and I settled in for what I expected to be a long, boring night of proving to myself that there was nothing supernatural happening in our house. Around 2 a.m., the temperature in the hallway dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. The girls were both sleeping peacefully, but as I watched, their bedroom door slowly began to close by itself. I stood up to push it back open, but before I could reach the door, I heard a woman's voice coming from inside the room. It was soft, almost melodic, like someone singing a lullaby. "Come away, little ones. Come away with Katie. The Shadow Lady is waiting, and she's got such pretty things to show you. Come away where the grown-ups can't hurt you anymore." I threw the door open and rushed into the room, but it was empty except for my sleeping daughters. However, I could still hear the voice, now coming from the walls themselves. "You can't protect them forever, Morrison man. The blood debt comes due, and it's the young ones who'll pay. Just like it's always been, just like it always will be." I scooped up both girls and carried them to our bedroom, where Rebecca and I spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch. The girls slept through everything, but in the morning, Emma woke up asking why we'd moved her away from Katie. She was just about to show me the special place where all the Morrison children go to play, Emma said, with disappointment. "Katie says there's lots of kids there, and they've been waiting so long for new friends to join them." That was enough for me. That morning, I called my cousin Marcus, who lived down in the valley, and asked if we could stay with him for a few days while we figured out what to do about the house. I didn't tell him the whole story, just said we were having some problems with the old place that needed professional attention. But as we were packing our bags to leave, Emma disappeared. We searched the house, the yard, the nearby woods, calling her name until our voices were hoarse. Rebecca was hysterical, and I was about to call the police when we heard Emma's voice coming from somewhere inside the walls of the house. She was singing the same lullaby I'd heard the night before, her sweet 8-year-old voice echoing through the rooms like she was trapped somewhere far away. I followed the sound to the basement, where I found something that made my heart stop. There was a hole in the stone foundation wall that I'd never noticed before. Not a crack or a gap, but a perfectly round opening about the size of a crawl space, leading into darkness. Emma's voice was coming from inside that hole. I grabbed a flashlight and squeezed through the opening, finding myself in a narrow tunnel that seemed to have been carved from the living rock. The tunnel sloped downward and curved to the right, and I followed Emma's singing voice through passages that no human hand had ever dug. After what felt like hours of crawling through that hellish maze, I emerged into a large underground chamber. The walls were covered with drawings, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, depicting children playing games, children holding hands in circles, children dancing with tall, shadowy figures that looked like women in old-fashioned dresses. And there, in the center of the chamber, was Emma. She was standing in a circle with what looked like other children, but as I got closer, I realized these weren't living children. They were translucent, flickering like candle flames, and their faces were hollow and sad. Emma was the only solid, real child in the group, but she was singing and dancing with them like they were her dearest friends. "Emma," I called out. "Emma, come to Daddy right now." She stopped singing and turned to look at me with eyes that weren't quite her own anymore. And when she smiled, it was with knowledge no 8-year-old should possess. "Daddy, you found Katie's special place. Isn't it wonderful? All the Morrison children are here. They have been waiting so long for me to come play with them." The ghostly children around her began to fade as I approached, but I could hear their voices whispering in unison. "Stay with us, Emma. Stay and play forever. The grown-ups will hurt you if you go back. They always hurt the children in the end." I grabbed Emma and pulled her away from the circle, carrying her kicking and screaming back through the tunnel to the basement. She fought me the whole way, crying that I was being mean to Katie and that the other children would be lonely without her. We left the house that day and never went back. I sold the property to a developer who demolished everything and turned it into a housing subdivision. I never told him about the underground chamber or the tunnel system. Let him deal with whatever he finds down there. Emma stopped talking to invisible friends after we moved away, but she's never been quite the same. Sometimes I catch her staring off into space with that same knowing smile, and she'll ask me when we're going back to visit Katie and the other children. "They're still waiting for me, Daddy," she'll say with perfect sincerity. "Katie says they have forever to wait, and someday I'll come back to play with them again." I've tried to research the history of our property, tried to find out what happened to all those Morrison children whose spirits were trapped in that underground chamber. But some records don't exist anymore, and some stories are too old and too painful for the living to remember. All I know is that the Bell Witch's curse didn't end with John Bell's death, and it didn't end with my granddaddy's death either. It's still out there in those Tennessee hills, still hunting for Bell descendants and their families, still trying to collect on a blood debt that goes back generations. And sometimes when I'm tucking Emma into bed at night, I hear her whispering to someone I can't see, promising that she'll come back to play soon, that she won't forget her friends who are waiting in the dark. The Bell Witch's kin are patient, and they've got all the time in the world. Story 10. The Last Light on Devil's Backbone. This is the story I swore I'd never tell, the one that's been eating at my soul for 3 years now. But I reckon it needs telling, if only to warn folks away from a place that should have been left alone long ago. My name is Jake Whitfield, and I was the last person to work the fire tower on Devil's Backbone Ridge in eastern West Virginia, before the Forest Service finally shut it down for good. Devil's Backbone gets its name from the way the ridge runs along the mountaintop, a narrow, jagged line of rock that looks like the spine of some ancient beast when you see it from a distance. The fire tower sat at the highest point, 200 feet of steel and wood that had been watching over these mountains since 1934. By the time I took the job in 2021, it was one of the last manned towers in the state. Most fire spotting is done by aircraft and satellite now. But the old-timers in the Forest Service insisted on keeping Devil's Backbone manned, said there were too many strange reports from that ridge to trust it to technology alone.
Hikers getting lost on trails they knew by heart, compasses spinning like toys, radio equipment failing for no apparent reason. They needed someone up there with experience, someone who understood these mountains and could tell the difference between natural phenomena and something more troubling. I'd worked fire towers for 15 years, most of them in remote locations where you might not see another human being for weeks at a time. I was used to the isolation, used to the way your mind can play tricks on you when you spend too much time alone with nothing but forest and sky for company. Or at least I thought I was used to it. The tower on Devil's Backbone was different from the start. Built into the foundation stones, almost hidden by decades of weather and moss, were symbols that didn't look like any standard construction markings. They were carved deep into the rock, and they had the feel of something much older than the 1930s. Spirals and interlocking circles that seemed to shift and change when you weren't looking directly at them. The previous tower operator, a grizzled old mountain man named Elijah Kahn, had left behind a collection of logbooks that dated back decades. The official entries were standard enough: weather observations, fire reports, maintenance notes. But in the margins of those logbooks, Elijah had been keeping a different kind of record. June 15, 1987. Lights moving through the forest again, but not like any vehicle I ever seen. Move too smooth, too purposeful. Follow the old Cherokee trails that ain't supposed to exist no more. October 3rd, 1995. Radio picked up voices again last night, speaking in a language I can't identify, but the tone sounds like some kind of ceremony or ritual. Signal was coming from grid reference 347B, but that's solid forest with no roads or structures. March 22, 2003. Something big is moving through the trees down in Panther Hollow, bigger than any bear or elk, and it's walking upright. Watched it for 20 minutes through the binoculars, but every time I tried to focus on it directly, my vision would blur like I was looking through heat shimmer. The entries went on for pages, documenting decades of unexplained phenomena. But it was Elijah's final entry, written just days before his retirement, that made my hands shake as I read it. April 10, 2021. They know I'm leaving. Been getting more active the past few weeks, like they're testing whoever's coming next. Found this carved into the tower platform this morning. The Guardian changes, but the watch continues. I tried to sand it off, but the letters just carved themselves deeper. Whoever takes this job better understand, you're not just watching for fires up here. You're watching for things that don't want to be watched, and they're watching you right back. I should have requested a transfer right then. Should have told the Forest Service that Devil's Backbone needed to be shut down permanently. But I was 52 years old with a pension to think about, and isolated duty came with a significant pay differential. I decided to give it 6 months, document everything I observed, and make my decision based on facts rather than one old man's paranoid fantasies. The first month was quiet enough. I settled into the routine: morning weather observations, afternoon forest surveys, evening equipment checks. The tower was equipped with all the modern conveniences: solar power, satellite internet, a well-stocked kitchen, and sleeping quarters that were comfortable enough for extended stays. But there were things that didn't feel right from the beginning. The radio equipment worked perfectly during the day, but after sunset, it would pick up transmissions that shouldn't have existed. Voices speaking in languages that sounded ancient, music that had no recognizable instruments, and sometimes what sounded like large groups of people chanting in unison. The signals always came from the same grid reference that Elijah had noted: Panther Hollow, a stretch of old-growth forest where no roads led and no structures existed. More disturbing were the lights. They appeared every few nights, moving through the forest in patterns that defied explanation. Not the random movement of animals or the steady progress of vehicles, but purposeful, coordinated movement,
that suggested intelligence. Sometimes there would be dozens of them, forming complex geometric shapes as they moved between the trees. Other times, a single light would trace the same path over and over, like something pacing back and forth in agitation. I documented everything meticulously, photographing what I could and recording detailed observations in the official logbook. But the camera equipment malfunctioned whenever the phenomena were most active, producing images that were either completely black or so overexposed they showed nothing but white glare. By the end of my second month on Devil's Backbone, I was beginning to understand why Elijah had filled his margins with notes about things that shouldn't exist. The isolation wasn't just physical. It felt like the normal rules of reality grew thin up there, like the boundary between the natural and supernatural was wearing away. That's when I started seeing them during the daytime. At first, it was just movement in my peripheral vision, shapes flitting between the trees too quickly to identify. But gradually, I began to see them more clearly. Tall figures in dark clothing, moving through the forest with the fluid grace of people who knew every root and stone intimately. They never came close enough for me to get a clear look at their faces, but something about the way they moved suggested they weren't entirely human. The first time one of them looked directly at me, I nearly fell off the tower platform. I was conducting my afternoon survey, scanning the forest with binoculars for any signs of smoke or unusual activity. In the distance, near the edge of Panther Hollow, I spotted one of the dark figures standing perfectly still among the trees. When I focused the binoculars on it, the figure turned to look directly at the tower. Its face was pale as moonlight, with features that were almost human, but not quite right. The proportions were off somehow, eyes too large, mouth too wide, bones too sharp beneath skin that looked thin as tissue paper. But it was the intelligence in those oversized eyes that truly terrified me. This wasn't some wild animal or trick of light and shadow. This was something that knew exactly what it was looking at, something that understood I was watching it just as intently as it was watching me. We stared at each other across that vast expanse of forest for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then the figure raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at me. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably threatening. That night, I radioed down to the Forest Service station and requested immediate backup. I told them I had security concerns and needed someone to come up and assess the situation. The response I got back wasn't what I expected. Copy that, Devil's Backbone. We've got your request, but we can't authorize backup based on security concerns without more specific information. Can you describe the nature of the threat? How do you explain to your supervisor that you're being stalked by something that isn't quite human? How do you put into an official report that the forest around your fire tower has become a gathering place for entities that shouldn't exist? I tried to keep my report factual and professional. Observing unauthorized personnel in the forest, individuals appear to be conducting some form of surveillance of the tower facility. Request backup to investigate and secure the perimeter. The response came back 6 hours later. Devil's Backbone, we've reviewed historical reports from your location. Similar concerns have been raised by previous operators, but investigation has never revealed evidence of unauthorized activity. Recommend you continue standard observation protocols and report only verifiable security threats. Translation: they thought I was crazy, just like they'd thought Elijah was crazy, and probably every tower operator before him. But I wasn't crazy, and I had proof. That night, The dark figures came closer to the tower than they'd ever come before. I counted at least 20 of them, moving through the forest in a wide circle around the tower base. They stayed just beyond the reach of the tower's floodlights, but I could see them clearly enough in the moonlight. They were chanting. The sound drifted up from the forest floor like smoke, voices raised in harmony that was hauntingly beautiful and utterly inhuman. The language was nothing I'd ever heard before, but the intent was clear. This was some kind of ritual, some kind of ceremony that centered on the fire tower itself. As I watched, the figures began to move in a coordinated dance, weaving between the trees in patterns that seemed to mirror the carved symbols I'd found in the tower's foundation stones. The dance grew more complex as the night wore on, and the chanting grew louder until it seemed like the entire mountain was resonating with their voices. Then, just before dawn, they all stopped at once and turned to look up at me. 20 pairs of those oversized, intelligent eyes fixed on my position in the tower cab. 20 pale faces tilted upward in perfect unison. And in that moment of absolute silence, I heard a voice that seemed to come from all of them at once. "The time of watching is ending. The guardian must choose." They faded away with the sunrise, melting back into the forest like shadows fleeing the light. But their message was clear enough. Whatever ancient compact that had kept them at a distance from the tower was breaking down, and they wanted me to make some kind of decision. I spent that day reviewing Elijah's logbooks more carefully, looking for any clue about what kind of choice they expected me to make. In his very earliest entries, I found references to the original compact and the price of guardianship that suggested the fire tower's purpose went beyond simple fire spotting. According to Elijah's research, the Cherokee had considered Devil's Backbone sacred ground, a place where the spirit world and the physical world intersected. When the fire tower was built in 1934, it had been constructed according to specific guidelines provided by the last Cherokee elder in the region, guidelines that included the placement of protective symbols in the foundation stones and the establishment of certain rituals to maintain the boundary between worlds. But as the years passed and the old knowledge was forgotten, those rituals had been abandoned. The tower operators became simple fire spotters rather than spiritual guardians, and the ancient compact that kept the mountain's supernatural inhabitants in check began to weaken. The dark figures I'd been seeing weren't invaders or threats. They were the mountain's original inhabitants, and they were growing restless as the boundaries that contained them continued to deteriorate. According to Elijah's notes, every tower operator eventually faced the same choice: learn to maintain the old rituals and serve as a true guardian of the boundary between worlds, or abandon the post and let whatever lived on Devil's Backbone reclaim their ancient territory. Most had chosen to leave. A few, according to local folklore, had chosen to stay and had never been seen again. On my final night on Devil's Backbone, the choice was made for me. I was awakened around midnight by the sound of footsteps on the tower stairs, heavy, deliberate steps that rang against the metal framework like hammer blows. But the steps weren't coming up from the bottom. They were coming down from above, from the platform that should have been empty. I grabbed my flashlight and pistol and crept to the window of the tower cab. On the platform above me, silhouetted against the stars, stood one of the dark figures. But this one was different from the others. Taller, more substantial, with an aura of age and authority that made my knees weak. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through autumn leaves, ancient and patient and infinitely sad. The watch is ending. The guardian has failed in his duties, and the compact is broken. We reclaim what was always ours. I wanted to run, wanted to flee down those stairs and never look back. But something about the figure's presence kept me rooted in place, unable to move or speak. You have seen the truth of this place. You know what dwells in these mountains, what has always dwelled here. The choice is simple. Become a true guardian and learn the old ways, or join those who came before you in eternal service. Around the base of the tower, I could see the other dark figures gathering, hundreds of them now, filling the forest as far as the eye could see. And among them, barely visible in the moonlight, I could make out other shapes, shapes that had once been human, but were now something else, something caught between the world of the living and the realm of the mountain spirits. Previous tower operators who had chosen to stay, I realized. Men who had become eternal guardians, bound to Devil's Backbone until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. I choose to leave, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The ancient figure nodded slowly. Then go, it said. Go now and never return. But know that your failure here has consequences. The boundary is broken, and what dwells on Devil's Backbone will no longer be contained to this ridge. The darkness spreads, and there is no one left to stand watch. I don't remember climbing down from that tower or driving away from Devil's Backbone. The next thing I clearly recall is sitting in my truck at a gas station 50 miles away, filling out my resignation paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The Forest Service officially closed the Devil's Backbone fire tower the next month, citing budget constraints and technological redundancy. But I know the real reason. They couldn't find anyone willing to take the job, not after word spread about what happened to me up there.
In the 3 years since I left Devil's Backbone, there have been increasing reports of strange phenomena throughout the region. Hikers disappearing on well-marked trails, electronics failing without explanation, sightings of dark figures in forests where no people should be. The darkness is spreading, just as the ancient guardian predicted, and there's no one left to hold it back. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries sounds that shouldn't exist, I think about going back. I think about climbing those 200 feet of steel and wood, taking up the watch that I abandoned, learning the old rituals that might restore the boundary between worlds. But then I remember those oversized eyes staring up at me from the forest floor, and I remember the shapes of men who had chosen to stay and had become something no longer entirely human. The fire tower on Devil's Backbone still stands, empty and dark against the mountain sky. And every night, the ancient inhabitants of those hills grow bolder, testing the boundaries that once contained them, spreading their influence into valleys and hollers where people sleep unaware of what watches them from the shadows. I failed in my duty as guardian, and now the darkness that lived on Devil's Backbone is loose in the world. The end. These 10 disturbing, true Appalachian mountain horror stories are inspired by real accounts shared online by people who experienced unexplained phenomena in the remote regions of Appalachia.
While the names and specific details have been changed to protect privacy, the essence of these terrifying encounters remains true to the experiences reported by those brave enough to share their stories. The Appalachian Mountains have always been home to mysteries that defy explanation, ancient spirits, unexplained disappearances, and encounters with things that shouldn't exist. These stories serve as a reminder that in the remote hollers and ridges of Appalachia, some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left alone. If you've had your own unexplained experiences in the Appalachian region, remember that you're not alone. These mountains hold secrets older than human memory, and sometimes those secrets reach out to touch the lives of those who venture too deep into the wilderness. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, in Appalachia, the old ways never truly die.